A thread just snapped inside the world of high-end watches. One bombshell, one decision has sent shockwaves across America, and it came straight from Rolex. The brand that has controlled the luxury market like a chessboard just flipped a major piece, and nobody, dealers, investors, or collectors, was ready. Rolex generates an estimated $4 to $5 billion in United States sales annually, making the United States its single most important market. When a company of this scale takes a sudden turn, things spiral out of control. The announcement, described as a structural shift, has already triggered heated debate across industry forums, trade groups, and luxury news circles. Some analysts say this change could completely reroute United States supply chains. Others warn it could spark a consumer backlash at a time when secondary market values are already down by double digits compared to the peak of 2022. Even authorized dealers that rarely speak publicly are whispering about the uncertainty this could create. If Rolex miscalculated, this could be one of the most damaging corporate moves in luxury history. But if they're right, it could be the strategy that reshapes the American watch market for decades. Today, we're diving into what Rolex just revealed, why it's shocking the country, and how it could backfire in ways no one is prepared for. Let's begin. Luxury in crisis. In late 2025, the luxury watch world shifted in a way few people predicted. Rolex, the Swiss watchmaker known around the world for prestige and price strength, prepared to raise prices for customers in the United States. A new official price list showed that, starting January 1st, 2026, nearly every Rolex model sold in the United States would cost more than before. This decision sent ripple effects through collectors' forums, retailer networks, and the broader luxury market. The surprise wasn't just the fact that prices were going up, it was how significantly they were rising. Sources report that on average, Rolex planned a 7% increase across its catalog in the United States. Steel watches, which many collectors prize for both durability and investment value, were set to rise by around 5.6%. Meanwhile, gold and precious metal models were expected to see close to 9% jumps in their official retail prices. This announcement arrived at a time when the United States was still the most important market for Swiss watchmakers. Luxury retailers like Watches of Switzerland reported strong sales from American buyers, with United States sales rising about 15% in the first half of 2025, driven largely by demand for top brands including Rolex. The United States accounted for close to 60% of profit for some retailers, underscoring how deeply Rolex and others relied on American customers to sustain their business growth. What made this price increase feel so dramatic to many collectors was the broader context. For years, Rolex had maintained a reputation for steady, predictable pricing. Annual price increases were common, but they tended to be limited and measured. A 7% average rise was noticeable, even without outside pressures. But the larger forces at work in 2025, especially trade policy changes, made this particular increase feel extraordinary and, to some, unpredictable. Dealers and authorized retailers received the new price books from Rolex in early December 2025. Many of them shared the information discreetly, knowing the implications would be significant. Authorized dealers, the only official channel through which Rolex sells new watches, suddenly faced a difficult conversation with customers. Explain why prices had jumped or risk losing sales to silence and frustration. For many buyers, the conversation was not theoretical, it was personal. Other Swiss brands like Patek Philippe, Omega, Audemars Piguet, and more were watching closely. Some were already responding to global pressures by adjusting their own prices. Others held off, waiting to see how Rolex's move would affect consumer behavior. In some corners, the word trend began to appear alongside tariffs and demand. Industry executives began to ask whether Rolex's price change was a signal rather than an isolated event. The timing of the January price increase also intersected with wider trade policy developments between the United States and Switzerland. Earlier in 2025, the United States had imposed very high tariffs at 1.39% on Swiss imports, which would have seriously inflated the cost of watches if left in place. Later negotiations reduced that rate back down to 15%, but not before creating cost pressures that manufacturers felt deeply. Many Swiss brands responded by raising prices as a hedge against volatility and unpredictability. For Rolex, the new price lists arrived as the market was already adapting to shifting conditions. Global economic uncertainty, currency fluctuations, and high demand in the luxury segment had already made watch prices a frequent subject of debate. But Rolex's price increase brought the idea home for many American buyers. Suddenly, the abstract forces of politics, economics, and global trade policy manifested in the price tag of a watch some buyers had been saving toward for years. Perhaps most striking was how this price move underscored the United States' outsized role in Rolex's global strategy. Despite trade challenges and tariff negotiations, the United States remained one of the strongest markets for the brand. The fact that Rolex chose to raise prices here rather than reduce allocations or pause shipments suggested a belief that demand would persist even in the face of higher costs. But what was the main catalyst for this sudden shift? Let's look into it. Tariffs and trade tension. An unexpected shift in United States trade policy sent shockwaves through the global luxury watch industry. The United States government announced a significant tariff increase on Swiss-made imports, which was initially slapped at 39% on most Swiss exports. This sudden move was intended as part of broader efforts to address trade imbalances, but it instantly transformed what had been a stable global market into a high-stakes battleground of politics, economics, and consumer behavior. For decades, the United States had been the single largest export market for Swiss watches. Millions of high-end timepieces, from Rolex to Patek Philippe to Omega, found their way into American boutiques each year. By 2024, United States imports of Swiss watches accounted for roughly 4.4 billion Swiss francs of Swiss exports, dwarfing almost any other international market. That made the United States not just important, but indispensable to Swiss watchmakers' global sales strategies. Then came the tariff announcement. Within weeks, the 39% levy on Swiss goods, part of a so-called reciprocal duty regime, began to reshape how Swiss brands viewed the American market. Suddenly, the cost of importing watches into the United States jumped. What had once been a predictable market with steady growth now faced uncertainty. Retailers braced for higher prices. Collectors worried about affordability. And brands questioned whether the United States would remain as vital a market as it once was. Almost immediately, industry insiders noticed the effects. United States retailers reported higher sticker prices even before the full tariff took effect. That was partly because some Swiss investors and importers began raising prices preemptively, attempting to absorb uncertainty by adjusting retail tags before the full tariff shock hit. This activity pointed to a broader trend. Tariffs don't just affect raw import costs. They spread through pricing strategies long before the official measures land. Across watchmaking hubs in Switzerland, executives began intense internal discussions. They faced a key question. Should brands absorb part of the tariff cost or pass the full burden to consumers? Smaller manufacturers, those without the brand power of Rolex, felt they had little choice but to make sharp price increases. Meanwhile, larger houses carefully balanced customer loyalty against the financial toll of higher tariffs. The result was a dual-track pricing response. Some brands chose to partially cushion the blow for customers by accepting narrower profit margins. Others, especially those with long waiting lists and strong secondary market demand, passed on most of the added costs through higher prices. What this meant for customers was simple. Watches that were already expensive became noticeably costlier almost overnight. The situation became more complex later in the year. In November 2025, a new trade deal between the United States and Swiss governments reduced the tariff from 39% to 15%, still historically high, but much less severe than the original levy. The announcement brought some relief to the industry, which had been bracing for more price increases or greater market disruption. Swiss watchmakers publicly welcomed the rollback, noting that it would help stabilize pricing and protect demand. Yet even with the reduced tariff, the impact remained significant. A 15% levy on Swiss watch imports was still far above pre-tariff levels, and brands had already adjusted prices in anticipation of higher costs. For luxury retailers, the tension between pricing and demand defined the rest of 2025. Some stores reported that demand held up surprisingly well, even with higher retail prices. A reminder that high-end demand often resists short-term market pressures. But higher prices in the United States did more than just adjust retail tags. They also altered the competitive landscape. With fewer consumers willing to pay inflated prices, some Swiss brands contemplated reducing United States supply in favor of regions with lower tariff burdens. In effect, tariffs could push allocation strategies to shift models out of the United States and into Europe or Asia, where pricing remained more predictable. In Switzerland, manufacturers and policymakers paid close attention to the American market's reactions. Slowdowns in exports, highlighted by dramatic drops in some reported export data, demonstrated how sensitive the industry was to trade shifts. In some months of 2025, Swiss watch exports to the United States decreased sharply compared to the previous year, a trend analysts attributed to tariff effects and the resulting market recalibration. Beyond pricing and exports, tariffs also featured in broader strategic discussions among luxury brands. Rolex, for example, continued to pursue its certified pre-owned program in the United States, reinforcing a longer-term approach to market penetration that went beyond new watch sales. This expanded emphasis on pre-owned buying and selling helped create additional value streams that were less directly tied to tariff pressures. However, what this means for Rolex has left the brand rethinking their actions. Consumers on the edge. In 2025, the United States luxury watch market entered a period of tension that went far beyond simple pricing changes. What began as adjustments to tariffs and duties soon evolved into a deeper question. Will American buyers slow down or step back altogether if Swiss-made watches become too expensive? This question grew louder as tariffs and pricing pressures continued to reshape how consumers think about Swiss luxury timepieces and how they choose to spend their money. For many years, Swiss watches held a special place in the American luxury market. They were not just timekeepers, they were symbols of success and milestones in life. But when tariffs on Swiss goods rapidly climbed into double digits and beyond, worry crept into discussions among buyers, dealers, and analysts alike. Suddenly, watches that once felt within reach for affluent buyers started to feel very expensive. Higher duties meant that a watch could be priced higher once tariffs were added across the supply chain. At first, many serious collectors and longtime Rolex customers appeared unbothered. They often buy watches regardless of pricing, because they see them as heirlooms or long-term investments. That group remained active in the market even as tariffs caused prices to rise. But beneath this surface, resilience was a growing unease among a different type of buyer: the aspirational and new-to-luxury consumer. These are people who do not own many luxury goods yet, and a steep price increase could change their plans entirely. Analysts watching consumer behavior began to notice subtle signs of stress. By April 2025, exports spiked by more than 149% year-over-year. This rush was not a signal of stronger long-term demand. Instead, it was a front-loading effect. Consumers and dealers hurried to buy before prices climbed even further. But once that rush passed, a sharp slowdown followed. In May, exports plunged by more than 25%. This indicated that buyers were pulling back or postponing purchases because they were no longer willing to absorb higher costs immediately. This pattern, rush then retreat, hinted at the psychological impact that price changes were having on consumers. Buyers were no longer reacting purely to the emotional thrill of matching with a brand like Rolex. Instead, they were thinking carefully about the value of what they were buying. When something becomes markedly more expensive overnight, especially due to policy shifts that feel out of the buyer's control, hesitation naturally follows. There were also clear signs that the secondary market, previously considered separate from official sales, was now influencing consumer decisions more than ever. Almost immediately after tariffs and price hikes began affecting retail tags, buyers started looking at pre-owned or gray market alternatives as a way to avoid inflated costs. Platforms that trade used watches saw significant spikes in activity, driven largely by American consumers seeking alternatives to new luxury watches that carried hefty duty-related prices. But this shift toward pre-owned also had its own risk. When too many buyers look away from new watches, authorized dealers may see lower foot traffic, fewer showroom sales, and weaker long-term customer loyalty. New watch sales are more profitable than second-hand transactions, and dealers depend on them for ongoing business health. If consumer demand permanently tilts away from new watches, the entire retail ecosystem could feel the strain. The reaction was not the same across all consumers. Wealthier, long-standing collectors often continued buying, despite price increases. Some even paid premiums for specific models because the waiting lists remained long and official supply limited. But a rising number of younger and aspirational buyers, especially those influenced by social media trends, hesitated. A global luxury survey highlighted that around 30% of consumers said they would shop less for luxury watches if prices increased significantly. Another emerging trend came from Gen Z buyers, the youngest group with disposable income. This generation often sought watches as status symbols shared online rather than as investments or heirlooms. With tariffs and price increases making new watches more costly, many of these buyers began exploring other channels or even traveling abroad to purchase watches at better prices. This behavior highlighted how price sensitivity was becoming a differentiator between traditional collectors and newer segments of the luxury audience. Economists and industry experts began to describe this situation as a demand shock with two phases. In the first phase, buyers rushed to purchase before prices rose further. In the second phase, many buyers, especially those who had already made initial purchases, paused their spending as they reassessed their priorities. This pause was not a brief hesitation. It reflected deep questions about whether luxury watches were worth higher prices, especially when financial conditions were still a concern for many potential buyers. Retailers themselves reported mixed signals. Some large sellers noted that United States sales remained strong overall, with certain categories still showing growth. But even within strong sales numbers, there were pockets of cooling interest, especially among models most affected by tariff-related pricing. Some retailers noticed that buyers began negotiating more aggressively or delaying purchases until they felt prices stabilized. This slowdown had broader implications for brand strategy. Luxury watchmakers had to rethink how they communicated value to buyers. Premium brands recognized that simply raising prices to cover tariffs would not be enough if it drove large groups of consumers to wait or defect to secondary markets. Instead, they began emphasizing value propositions like heritage, craftsmanship, certification programs, and after-sales services to maintain buyer interest. By the end of 2025, the backlash risk had become one of the luxury watch industry's central concerns. It was no longer just about tariffs or short-term price adjustments. It was about how consumer perception of value was changing in the United States market. Retailers and brands that failed to respond to this shift risked losing the long-term loyalty of buyers who might never return once they found alternatives that felt more affordable or smarter financially. Meanwhile, the effects of these changes seemed to cost Rolex more than expected. Delay and industry reactions. The global luxury watch world has entered a phase of deep uncertainty that has nothing to do with trends or fashion. It had everything to do with trade policy, tariffs, and supply chain strategy. The Rolex brand found itself navigating an unusual situation. The United States government had increased tariffs on Swiss imports, and brands were being forced to rethink how they shipped products, allocated stock, and managed customer expectations. What followed was a period defined by reactive planning by the company. One of the earliest reactions to this uncertainty was shipment holds and pauses. Instead of sending inventory to the United States as usual, some Swiss brands began to delay shipments entirely, opting to wait and see how negotiations and tariff policy would evolve. According to industry insiders, this hesitation was not limited to Rolex. Multiple major Swiss watchmakers reportedly held back stock, including popular models, as they tried to gauge whether the high tariffs would stick or soften in future trade talks. In previous years, production and shipment schedules for luxury timepieces were finely tuned to demand. New stock flowed regularly from Swiss production facilities through distribution networks to American retailers and boutiques. Watches were shipped months in advance of release dates, planned according to seasonal buying behavior, and allocated based on long-established patterns. Suddenly, this rhythm was disrupted. Instead of shipments timed to coincide with sales peaks, stock simply sat awaiting clarity. The result was felt across the industry. Authorized dealers in major United States cities began reporting lower than normal deliveries of new watches. Retailers accustomed to a steady dispatch of inventory soon found fewer shipments arriving. Some buyers who had placed orders months earlier were told that their watches were stuck in transit or awaiting customs changes. What had once been a predictable global movement of luxury products now felt like a stalled supply chain. This delay in shipments was not simply a tactical pause. It was a strategic response to protect margins and preserve inventory value. With tariffs adding up to nearly 40% of a watch's wholesale cost, brands and distributors had to decide whether to absorb those costs or pass them on to buyers in the form of higher prices. Holding back shipments bought time, allowing brands to see if trade negotiations would ease the burden or if alternative solutions could be found. For the Swiss watch industry, long established, tradition-driven, and cautious in its approach, this was not an easy decision. Watchmakers normally avoid abrupt changes because they can undermine dealer loyalty and disrupt carefully managed brand prestige. But facing one of the most significant trade policy changes in decades, many executives opted for what they saw as cautious patience rather than immediate, costly action. In many ways, the pause in shipments mirrored broader industry reactions to the tariff situation. Smaller brands, without deep financial reserves or strong brand power, felt the pressure almost immediately. They found it difficult to carry costly inventory or risk losing money if tariff costs could not be passed on. Larger houses, including ones with multiple luxury offerings and diversified sales channels, had slightly more room to maneuver, but even they found it necessary to reconsider traditional supply scheduling and distribution strategies. One of the immediate effects of delayed shipments was a reshuffle in global allocation. With fewer watches heading to the United States, brands began redirecting inventory to other regions. The United Kingdom and Japan, for instance, experienced increased allocations as companies looked for markets less impacted by trade barriers. The boutiques in those regions reported record allocations of certain models, not because demand in those countries surged, but because the United States market was effectively unavailable or risky for many shipments. This shift was particularly notable for high-demand models that had historically been difficult to secure in the United States. Under normal circumstances, stock for these pieces would be tightly allocated to major American cities. With shipments delayed, boutiques in other regions found themselves flush with inventory that buyers in the United States had expected to receive. At the same time, the industry faced rapid fluctuations in export data that reflected the impact of both shipment delays and tariff pressure. In early 2025, Swiss watch exports soared as brands rushed to export ahead of anticipated tariff introduction, a process known as front-loading. That spike was followed by sharp declines once tariffs took effect, with exports to the United States falling heavily in subsequent months. These sharp swings in movement data showed just how volatile the situation had become and outlined the challenges brands faced in balancing shipment timing with cost management. The consequences of delayed shipments extended beyond inventory headaches. Authorized dealers began to feel pressure on retail floors. With less incoming stock, showrooms looked emptier than usual. Sales consultants found themselves explaining why certain models were unavailable or delayed. For many buyers, especially those who followed specific release cycles or waited months for a piece, the situation was confusing and frustrating. It was no longer clear when, or if, the watches they wanted would arrive. This environment also created strategic uncertainty for brands and retailers alike. Should dealers stock less? Should they charge higher prices to cover potential cost increases? Or should they hold firm and wait for tariff negotiations to ease? These were not simple decisions. They involved forecasting demand under shifting economics and understanding how supply hiccups might impact brand loyalty over the long term. Interestingly, some parts of the industry responded by accelerating alternative sales channels. Both sellers and buyers turned increased attention to the secondary market for luxury watches, including certified pre-owned programs. Programs like Rolex's Certified Pre-Owned (CPO) network saw growing interest as previously purchased timepieces became short-term substitutes for new inventory that sellers could not ship. This trend was not entirely positive. It indicated strong brand loyalty, but it also reflected how delays disrupt traditional sales pipelines. In many ways, these delays forced companies to think creatively about logistics and market strategy. Discussions emerged about diversifying supply routes, increasing local assembly or certification in markets with heavy tariffs, and even considering new partnerships to maintain market access without absorbing extreme duty costs. These conversations reflected how supply chain strategy had moved to the forefront of luxury brand planning in a way that was not common before. So how does Rolex's actually plan to handle this shift? Red alert: Rolex issues warning. In late 2025, the leadership of Rolex began to issue a series of rare and pointed warnings about the future of the luxury watch industry. Rolex's chief executive officer, Jean-Frédéric Dufour, articulated how the company saw the world around it changing, and how that change could affect watchmakers, retailers, and collectors alike. These remarks were vital not because they were vague corporate talk, but because they revealed how far beyond product design and pricing Rolex's leaders were thinking. Rolex rarely puts its executives in the spotlight. The brand is famously private, with most communications focused on product features or heritage. But in November 2025, at a major industry event called Dubai Watch Week, CEO Jean-Frédéric Dufour gave a rare keynote address that drew global attention. In that speech, he made comments that went beyond sales figures or production challenges. He spoke broadly about the health and direction of the industry itself. Dufour began his address by focusing on something that might seem odd to some: distribution strategy. Rolex had acquired a Swiss retail group called Bucherer in recent years, which prompted speculation that the brand might expand its own stores worldwide. But Dufour made it clear that this was not Rolex's long-term plan. Instead, he said that the company would continue to rely on its network of authorized dealers rather than rapidly build its own boutiques. He described this traditional model as the magic recipe. That remark alone was significant because it revealed a deeper principle of Rolex's strategy, which is stability and tradition over aggressive retail expansion. Dufour explained that decentralized retail, where local partners have deep knowledge of customers, was essential for Rolex's ability to connect with buyers in meaningful ways. He stressed that relationships with clients should be long-standing and deep, not transactional. This message became more pointed when Dufour addressed what he described as a major risk facing the industry: losing touch with customers. He warned other watch brands that they must invest in lasting client relationships or risk suffering the same fate as industries that have seen customers drift away due to impersonal sales approaches. He specifically referenced the automotive sector, where connection between brand and consumer had weakened over time. In this context, Dufour's remarks resonated like a strategic wake-up call. The world he described was one where consumers were beginning to value experiences, emotion, and meaning as much as the objects they purchased. This posed a challenge for heritage brands that traditionally relied on reputation and craftsmanship alone. Dufour urged the industry to think about how to make the act of buying and owning a mechanical watch feel like a relationship, not just a transaction. Another layer of Dufour's strategic message centered on talent and craftsmanship. In his speech, he highlighted the importance of apprenticeships and training programs. Rolex, he said, supported roughly 500 apprentices across multiple disciplines. He framed this investment in human capital as essential to preserving not just the brand's future, but the future of mechanical watchmaking itself, as failing to nurture new generations of watchmakers would leave the entire industry vulnerable. This focus on human capital was not random. Across Switzerland, CEOs have been voicing concern about negative factors. A recent survey of Swiss business leaders revealed that many executives cited geopolitical conditions as the biggest risk to their company's futures, with even more planning to invest in efficiency, automation, and localization to counter uncertainty. Rolex's emphasis on apprenticeships and craft may be its way of ensuring that human skill remains at the center of a business challenged by external forces. Dufour's comments also extended into how the brand viewed the value and purpose of watches themselves. In other interviews, he noted his discomfort with how some buyers treat watches as financial investments rather than objects of heritage and craft. He made a point of warning that treating timepieces like stocks or commodities risked distorting what makes them culturally meaningful. Rolex's position was that watches must be appreciated for emotional and mechanical value, not primarily for their resale potential. Other insights from Rolex's leadership reiterated this philosophy of balance between tradition and innovation. Dufour spoke about how Rolex uses technology such as artificial intelligence, AI, to support quality control in manufacturing. He emphasized that while machines and digital tools are useful, the human element of watchmaking remains indispensable. This view underlined a strategic choice to marry cutting-edge efficiency with lasting craftsmanship, rather than letting automation erase the human character of watchmaking. Taken together, these warnings form a coherent perspective from Rolex. The brand sees an industry at a crossroads. On one path are short-term profits, rapid expansion, and pricing driven by external pressures. On the other are long-term relationships, rooted craftsmanship, and emotional value tied to heritage. Rolex's executive leadership, as stated by Dufour, clearly places itself on the second path, one that prioritizes connection and legacy over quick gains or reactive strategies. This message also has implications for how Rolex interacts with authorized dealers and the broader distribution network. By recommitting to these partnerships, rather than expanding its own retail footprint, Rolex signaled that it values trusted intermediaries who understand their local customers and can foster personal ties. This approach can be contrasted with direct-to-consumer models adopted by other luxury sectors, and suggests that Rolex sees local engagement and long-term loyalty building as an advantage. Dufour's warnings were not simply general counsel for the industry. They were specific strategic signals that Rolex intends to stay disciplined, relationship-oriented, and deeply rooted in traditional values, even as global markets and consumer behaviors shift. In a world where luxury brands are under pressure to innovate quickly or chase short-term profits, Rolex's leadership has given a strategic warning that may shape the industry for years to come. If this breakdown changed how you think about luxury, let us know in the comments. Do you think Rolex's strategy would work in repositioning the United States market? Drop your thoughts below. Hit that like button. Subscribe so you never miss our next deep dive into the hidden dynamics of wealth, status, and the brands desperately trying to capture both. Because in luxury, nothing is permanent.